Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. It's a research paper that really digs into this idea of unwitting neo-Nazis, which sounds a little paradoxical, right?
It does.
How can you be a neo-Nazi without knowing it?
Yeah.
But that's kind of the point of this paper. It uses AI, ChatGPT, Gemini, all that stuff to sort of analyze modern extremism and how these ideas kind of seep into our thinking without us realizing it.
It is a fascinating approach using AI models to analyze something as nuanced as ideology. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how this research highlights the danger of what we might consider to be harmless behaviors and how they can contribute to these larger societal issues.
Yeah, it's that whole thing of the paper uses this term faxism. I love that term. It's basically this idea that, facts and logic are the end-all, be-all right.
Yeah.
You got to throw empathy and context out the window.
Out the window.
It's like, imagine you're talking to someone and they're like, well, the data doesn't support that, so your feelings are invalid. That kind of thing.
Well, and it's interesting because on the surface, it can seem harmless. Facts, logic is logic. But when you start to really think about the implications of consistently prioritizing that over empathy and lived experience, you can see how that really does create a breeding ground for these more extreme ideologies to take root.
Yeah. And that's where I think this term unwitting neo-Nazis comes in.
Yeah,
right? Which is
exactly. And that's really what the paper is exploring.
How can someone be a neo-Nazi and not know it?
Well, you have to consider the idea of denial and even more importantly, perhaps self-awareness. So, the paper describes individuals who would reject that label outright. You say neo-Nazi, they're going to say absolutely not. That's not me. But then if you look at some of their actions and beliefs, they may unknowingly align with those very principles. So they might find themselves justifying certain authoritarian tendencies, harboring certain prejudices, or even just selectively choosing facts to support their biases while remaining completely convinced that they're on the side of reason and truth.
Yeah. It's like, it's almost like they're kind of blind to it, right?
They are. It's a blind spot.
Like they're not consciously trying to be a neo-Nazi, but their actions and their beliefs kind of lead them down that path.
Exactly.
And, I think we've all probably encountered people like that at some point in our lives.
Oh, absolutely.
And maybe even, it's a little unsettling to think about, but
yeah.
Maybe we've even caught ourselves, falling into some of those thought patterns.
Without a doubt. And that's why this idea of self-examination that the paper emphasizes is so crucial. It suggests we all need to take a step back and really look at our own beliefs and behaviors.
Yeah.
Ask ourselves those tough questions. Are we truly open to diverse perspectives? Or are we clinging to facts and logic as a way to shut down anything that doesn't fit into our worldview? Are we willing to acknowledge our own biases? Or are we projecting them onto others?
Yeah, it's like it's not just about understanding these concepts of like faxism and unwitting neo-Nazis, in some theoretical way. It's really about using those concepts as a mirror, right? To reflect back on our own, our own thinking, our own behavior, our own potential blind spots.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's a mirror. And recognizing that extremism isn't just something out there, it's something we need to be vigilant about within ourselves. It's about cultivating that self-awareness that helps us navigate this increasingly complex world.
Yeah. So how do we do that? I mean,
it
all sounds very theoretical, right? Like, okay, I need to examine my beliefs. But where do you even begin to untangle that web of biases and assumptions, both within ourselves and in society at large?
One of the things that the paper points to is this idea of pragmatism as a potential solution.
Okay. So like a more practical approach to all of this.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the world is messy and complex. And trying to force everything into these neat little boxes, it's just not realistic.
Okay. So instead of like clinging to these rigid ideologies, we need to be more flexible in our thinking.
Right.
More open to different perspectives.
Yeah.
Embrace the gray areas a little bit more.
Embrace the gray. And that's what pragmatism encourages us to do. It's about acknowledging the limits of pure logic. Facts and data are important, but they don't always tell the whole story.
Right. So it's like finding that balance between, being informed and being open-minded.
Exactly.
Which, let's be honest, can be really challenging sometimes.
It can be.
Especially in today's world.
Especially today. Oh, it can. But that's where I think this deep dive in this research in particular gets really interesting. It suggests that cultivating what they call a quantum mindset can actually help us navigate this complexity and avoid falling prey to those extremist tendencies.
Quantum mindset. Okay, now that sounds a little A little out there. Like, are we getting into physics here?
It might sound intimidating, but it's really not. It's really about shifting our perspective in
Yeah.
a way that allows us to be more adaptable, more resilient to these kinds of, harmful ideologies. Because you see neo-Nazi ideologies, they often thrive on fear and uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
They offer simple solutions to complex problems, and people gravitate towards those solutions when they're feeling, overwhelmed or threatened.
Right. So it's like instead of, freaking out about the unknown,
Mm-hmm.
a quantum mindset is more about like embracing it.
Yeah.
Like seeing that uncertainty not as something to be afraid of,
Mm-hmm.
but as an opportunity for growth and learning.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that the world is constantly changing. Our understanding of it is constantly evolving. So instead of clinging to these rigid ideologies, we need to be more willing to adapt, question our assumptions, and really consider multiple perspectives.
Right. It's like that old saying, the only constant is change.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put this quantum mindset into practice? I mean, does the paper give us any like concrete?
It does. And it starts with this idea of reframing uncertainty as opportunity, which is basically acknowledging that complexity is a natural part of life. We can't force everything into neat little boxes.
Right. Okay. So we're embracing the gray areas. We're not clinging to that black and white thinking. But how does that actually, help us avoid these unwitting neo-Nazi tendencies we were talking about?
Well, it all comes down to recognizing that our own perspectives are limited and that we don't have all the answers. So it's about being open to learning from others, even those who hold different views than our own. And the paper uses this interesting idea of tension triangles to illustrate this point. Right. You mentioned that earlier. It's like understanding how different concepts relate to each other, right? But I'm still not quite clear on how that applies in a real world context.
Sure. So let's take the concept of diversity, for example. Instead of just focusing on diversity in isolation, a tension triangle approach would encourage us to consider the interconnectedness of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay.
So it's about understanding how these concepts push and pull on each other, creating a more dynamic and nuanced understanding.
So instead of striving for that one singular correct answer, we're engaging in this ongoing process of exploring and evaluating these different ideas.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second strategy, which is promoting interconnectedness.
Okay.
And this is all about recognizing that we're not isolated individuals. We're part of a larger web of relationships. Our actions have ripple effects, impacting those around us and the world at large.
Right. So it's like fostering a sense of empathy and responsibility.
Yes.
Recognizing that our choices have consequences that go beyond, just our immediate sphere. Exactly. And this ties back to that self-examination we were talking about earlier. If we want to avoid unwittingly contributing to these harmful ideologies, we need to be mindful of how our words and actions might affect others.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. It's so easy to get caught up in our own little bubbles and forget that we're all connected. Okay, so we've got reframing uncertainty. We've got promoting interconnectedness. What's the third strategy for cultivating this quantum mindset?
The third strategy is encouraging measurement events.
Okay. Measurement events. Now, when I hear measurement, I'm thinking like rulers and scales. What do you mean by measurement events?
Well, in this context, it's about using specific events as opportunities to assess our progress and make adjustments.
So kind of like taking the temperature of society in a way.
Yeah.
Like seeing where we're at and then using that information to guide our actions. But what kind of events are we talking about here?
It could be anything from local elections to community gatherings to even something as simple as having a conversation with someone who holds different views. These events can serve as a gauge of how well we're doing in terms of promoting inclusivity, fostering dialogue, and creating a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so we've got these three strategies. Reframing uncertainty, promoting interconnectedness, encouraging measurement events. It's like a roadmap for cultivating a more mindful and engaged approach to life.
It is, and the paper argues that these strategies are essential not only for countering the rise of neo-extremism, but also for creating a more compassionate and resilient society. But let's get real for a second. How do we actually reach those who are already entrenched in these harmful ideologies? The unwitting neo-Nazis who may not even realize the extent of their biases?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, it can feel a little daunting. But I'm hoping this research gives us some guidance on that front.
I think it does. It talks about approaching this challenge from a few different angles, emphasizing things like education through context, challenging without condemning, and creating constructive alternatives as strategies for, reaching these people who might be harboring these unwitting extremist views.
Right, and I think breaking those down a little bit further can be helpful. So when we talk about education through context, we're not simply talking about, throwing facts and figures at people. It's about weaving those facts into compelling narratives that resonate on an emotional level. Because stories have this unique power to make information stick and to help people connect with ideas in a way that goes beyond pure logic.
Right. So instead of just hitting someone with a bunch of statistics about hate crimes, you might share a personal story. That really illustrates the human impact of prejudice. Exactly. Or you might use historical examples, works of art, even pop culture references to kind of illustrate the dangers of these extremist ideologies. It's about meeting people where they are, using familiar frameworks to make these complex ideas more relatable.
Yeah. It's about fostering empathy and understanding, rather than just lecturing people about what they should or shouldn't believe.
Exactly. And this ties directly into that second strategy, challenging without condemning, instead of labeling people, which can often trigger defensiveness and shut down dialogue. We need to focus on dismantling those harmful narratives that they've internalized.
So asking questions, listening actively, really trying to understand the underlying fears and insecurities that might be driving these beliefs.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where people feel safe to express themselves without feeling judged or attacked. Now, this is not about condoning hateful views. It's about understanding their origins and engaging in a way that encourages critical thinking and self-reflection.
So it's like you're planting these seeds of doubt, encouraging them to question their own assumptions and to maybe look at things from a different perspective.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about that third strategy, creating constructive alternatives?
This one is all about channeling the energy and passion that often gets directed toward hate and division into something more positive and productive. It's about offering people a sense of belonging and purpose that isn't rooted in those extremist ideologies.
So supporting initiatives that promote inclusivity, encouraging people to get involved in their communities, finding ways to build bridges instead of walls.
Exactly. It's about creating spaces where people can connect with others who share their values, contribute to something larger than themselves, and find meaning and purpose in ways that don't involve exclusion or hatred.
Well, this has been a fascinating and honestly a little bit challenging deep dive. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we all have a responsibility to examine our own beliefs and behaviors, and to be mindful of how our words and actions might impact others.
I couldn't agree more. None of us are immune to bias. And it's only through that honest self-reflection that we can begin to dismantle those harmful patterns within ourselves and hopefully create a more just and equitable world.
Right. It's like that old saying, be the change you want to see in the world. But in this case, it's about being aware of that potential for unwitting extremism within ourselves and actively working to counter it. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take a closer look at your own beliefs and actions. Remember, change starts with each and every one of us.